But Seamus, fill some time for me, would you?
Some time. Hi, I'm Seamus. I'm pretty sure I've done a tasting for almost everyone here in the room. But for anyone who doesn't know me, I look after the premium spirits capacity at Brown-Forman. Brown-Forman, obviously being the wonderful company that owns the GlenDronach Distillery and the Ben Riach Distilling Company in general, so also Ben Riach and GlenGlasser. As I'm filling time, I am just kind of obviously going to say the usual for anyone who is in the room. Toilets are at the back. Maybe don't make a tit of yourself if you do try and take any of these glass lids off the glasses, because it will make a hell of a racket and everyone's going to turn around and look at you and you're going to feel like a little bit of a fool.
You're getting good at that. So you've been to enough of these. You can do this.
I've been to a fair few. I am usually the guy at the back kind of throwing things and making cheeky comments. So it's very heartening to see someone who looks equally cheeky at the back there. Don't worry, that wasn't directed at you. It was clearly the bohemian man who looks like some sort of Russell Brand. You're right, mate.
Alrighty, we look like we are live everywhere that we need to be. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. This is the brave new world, a little bit of tastings and bringing people together and all that sort of thing. As has become tradition a long time before, the world sort of ended. But every time there is a new allocation of GlenDronach single casks, indeed even Ben Riach single casks into the country, we need to open them and taste them, because that's what these things are for. And particularly with vintages getting further and further into the distance and into the past, prices obviously go up and up. Death taxes and whiskey prices going up. That's what happens in this world. It's more important than ever, I think, to get these whiskies into people's mouths. As you've probably, whether you're watching on the YouTube, on the Facebook, or in the Zoom chats, you've probably been to a few virtual tastings over the past 12 months, whether it's with us or with other people, and it's been interesting. There are certain, I don't think you can ever get around the feeling and the community of drinking whiskey next to someone, but a lot of people have said, oh, it must be good getting back to intimate tastings again. I was like, yeah, well, I've seen people in pajamas, in their bedrooms, in their living room. I've seen their family and their living room pets walk behind. So it's its own way. It's a very intimate thing. But we have essentially opened 2 bottles for tonight's tasting instead of 1. So we've got about 85 people joining in, absolutely at capacity again. And we've sent packs to Perth, to Tassie, to North Queensland, so all over the place. As I said, if you weren't listening, if you are tuning in from one of the social medias, unfortunately Thalita couldn't make it to be with us tonight. She was feeling a little bit unwell, and the first thing you do when you're unwell in 2021 is to calm down and stay at home for a little bit, for as long as possible until that passes. So we're going to power on, but I'm going to be monitoring the various channels we're on, including the room, for questions. And we will go from there while I sort of throw to Seamus and try and bring up this fantastic TV that we've bought just in time for tasting season, along in this room with some images that we'll try and share into the chat as well. But Seamus,
absolutely,
how does it feel to be back running tastings again?
Well, I would say it is a very funny feeling, because if anyone has seen me do any of these before, I usually like to march up and down and kind of lean over if anybody has any quiet questions that they're not feeling too confident about. So unfortunately, you guys are just going to have to get a little more confident and be happy to ask the potentially silly questions to the entire room. I say that, there are obviously no silly questions. Sorry, I keep getting distracted because I can see myself here and I just look like an absolute tit. And that's something I'm never going to get used to. When I'm on Zoom, I have my camera covered or my screen covered so I can't see this. So we'll just have to put up with it. But yeah, I mean, we're here to drink some GlenDronach single cask. I think we're all very excited that we've actually been able to make it to this day, and there is actually people in this room. I know for me, this is the second tasting that I've hosted in as many weeks, and it's my second tasting of the last 12 months, really. So very excited to be here drinking whiskey. And I'm a really, really big believer that if I'm sitting here talking, you should be drinking whiskey, because honestly, it makes my voice a lot easier to put up with, but also you might laugh at a few more of my jokes. So it's kind of a win-win for the both of us. So if everyone wants to pick up whiskey number 1, I'll tell you a little bit about the distillery and warm us into the whiskey. So please hesitate on shotting it. You know, I want you to kind of get to grips with it first. I guess I should say first off, is this anybody's first whiskey tasting? Amazing. That's always a good sign. And more to the point, is this anybody's first GlenDronach? I almost think that's not true. I know that's not true. I'm not sure about you, sir, but for the sake of a couple of people that stuck their hands up, GlenDronach, as most of us probably know, is a Highland distillery. It sits right on the border of Speyside and Highland, but very much embrace Highland in its DNA. Those images are just popping off, aren't they?
Just as well, getting a couple of questions through, we are going to move in terms of order tonight, whether we're going to, obviously if you're in the room you can see, we're going in ages. So when Seamus talks about whiskey number one, we are talking about the 2009. We had a bit of a think about this and a bit of a throw around. I haven't tried any of these yet. Seamus has. It seems like the most obvious way to do it. There is a bit of a curveball in there. There's one Oloroso cask amongst the swathe of Pedro Jimenez cask that might throw a bit of grit and things in there.
Absolutely.
But we are talking about number one is 2009.
11-year-old, yes. Sorry for anyone who was asking questions. And Scott has said we are going in order of age, but then there is a little dupe on the order of the sheets where it goes from a 1992 back to a 1993 and then back to a 1990. So we're making it very easy for you. But yeah, so I'll explain each whiskey as we get to it. But yes, whiskey number one, 11-year-old. And as I was saying, GlenDronach is technically a Highland distillery, though right on the border, and it has kind of really embraced that Highland personality in its whiskey production. We want to make a very viscous, heavy spirit. The way we're fermenting our malt and the way we're distilling is to try and get as much of those rich, luscious oils as possible. And then we want to pass that on to our cask character. So the special thing about GlenDronach of many is we are generally a full sherry maturation distillery. I know a lot of people talk about sherry maturation and the instinct is to say finish. It's a sherry finish. Some people use it as a supplement for maturation. That is not the case with these whiskies. These are whiskies that have spent their entire life in sherry casks, with exception to the last one, which also has some port cask thrown into it. But again, full maturations. So 11-year-old Pedro Jimenez. I might get to grips with this one as well, because this is one of two that I actually haven't presented but have drank just a little bit of, just the responsible amount. And it is kind of exactly what you expect from a single cask GlenDronach at this age. It is spirity, it is bright, but the cask is still playing a part. I think this is quite a nice parallel to what you see in the normal 12-year-old. We're kind of taking one of the bones out of what makes up the GlenDronach 12 and just expanding that to a 11-year-old single cask. So I'm going to do that classic thing of, does everyone here kind of know how to get to grips with whiskey? Getting mostly nods and some kind of befuddled looks at the back. But
you only mix it around and throw a bit on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, if your last name is Patterson and there's some accusations your way, you might chuck it on the ground and say hello to it. But here we want to just tell it in a few ways. We want to look at the colour, realise that colour means very little in terms of flavour or quality, but at least we look. Look how competent we look holding our glasses up. Aren't we all professionals? Then we want to nose it. There's a lot of theory about the best way to nose it. Honestly, it's sticking your nose in a glass. There's not too many wrong ways to do it. If it hurts, you're doing it wrong. If it smells good, you're doing it right. This is a fairly spirity whiskey, so maybe a drop of water at this stage would brighten it up, bring out a little bit of the kind of spirit character as well. And then we want to basically have a sip. And that's a lot of fun. That's a hell of a first dram to start on. As we're starting on a cask strength single cask as our first dram, that is probably going to be a bit of a kick to the back of the throat. That's all right. That's where we're starting. It's kind of your next drink is going to be a lot easier if this kind of proof is new to you.
So Seamus, in terms of, this is what, batch 18 of the single cask series.
Yeah.
What is the process of choosing a single cask? Because there's obviously now a few different SKUs, and even if we put the 12, 15, 18, 21, that some are on allocation, off allocation to the sides. Then you've got like Grandeurs and Kingsmans and this sort of things. What makes a cask go into a single cask batch rather than splinter off into something else?
It's a great point and a great question. Sorry, I'll answer it with a little bit of a kind of where this came from. So obviously the GlenDronach distillery wasn't always owned by Brown-Forman. Prior to us, it was owned by an individual by the name of Billy Walker, who owned the Ben Riach Distilling Company. And he was somewhat of a kind of character in the industry. I'm sure most people have heard his name uttered in these halls once or twice. And basically, he purchased the GlenDronach distillery in late 2008 from the Pernod Ricard team. And on taking it, he started digging through the warehouses, and he started digging, and came across all these ridiculous casks. And there was casks from the 1970s, 80s, 90s that were just showing these amazing characters that wasn't being showcased by the core range, and could never be showcased by the core range because it was left of center. And if we were in a situation where we had to produce kind of a consistent 15, 18, 21-year-old, that cask would maybe add a little accent to that 15, 18, 21-year-old, but it wouldn't be shown off with all its character. So Billy, as many other distilleries are now doing today, identified those casks, kept a record on them, and every now and again, well, not every now and again, probably a little too frequently for the yields of these casks, started checking back in on them. And as soon as he felt they were ready, that's where batch one was released. And yeah, that's what they look like. But from there, the program has kind of evolved. As you heard, this is batch 18. So we've kind of doubled down on doing them as often as possible. Basically, at the moment, it kind of falls to about once a year, but COVID allowing, it's been a little bit chaotic, obviously. And with those once a year releases, it really gives Rachel, our new master distiller, a chance to kind of really review stocks and satisfy all of the world's hunger. So in a lot of ways, this is probably the only way we're going to be trying single cask GlenDronachs for a fairly long time. In your question of whether they go to Kingsman or Grandeur or single casks, it's a great question. It basically falls to where is the whiskey going to perform best. When Rachel's sampling them all, is this something that she can do a no holes barred marriage of casks on, where we can take a 30-year-old, a 27-year-old, and a 32-year-old and marry them up and they're the business? Or do we want to champion each one individually and they're showing the best character there? And I think people always get a little funny about marrying casks. They say, oh, you're blending, you're kind of ruining the character of one cask. But that's what whiskey is and always has been. We want to take the best of one, bring it to the best of another, and hopefully we have the best of both worlds in the one whiskey. Single casks, on the other hand, are casks that are so clearly great here, let's release this as a showcase of individual character, a bit of a DNA of the distillery. And it has really carried on into the modern era.
One comment coming through here from Whiskey in My Jam down in Tasmania, shoe leather on the nose of the 09, which I think is in a big way.
Absolutely, yeah. Does anyone local want to call out any tasting notes as well? Because shoe leather is a great shout, and we're currently being beaten by a Tasmanian. Everyone laughed, and no one brought a tasting note. Second or third whiskey, you guys are going to be into it.
Just a note that we normally make at tastings like this as well. Just a note that we're not going to make it at tastings like this is that if you're enjoying these whiskies, and you should be, take the time to enjoy them. Really sit and think about them, because in a lot of cases, this might be the last or the only opportunity you get to try this, unless some bars have them on there, because I have one bottle of this to sell to 80 people at the end of this tasting and that sort of thing. So these are very, very limited into Australia. And I'll explain how we're going to, if anyone wants to buy a bottle at the end of the tasting, I'll explain that. But the first whiskey is always the one to disappear the quickest. Doesn't matter what you're tasting and what price it is and what's going on. But just a reminder, if you haven't already, just to sort of take your time with these ones to make them come through.
I can't believe you offered a discount on it for tonight. That's amazing.
We have something happening here on the
chat. We have Thalita Alves connecting.
Wasn't expecting that, but
we'll maybe let her do it quietly, just in case she's just sat here trying to watch.
Yeah, just trying to watch. Yeah. Did anyone add a drop of water to that? I haven't. Yay or nay?
Some without then just softened it off.
Yeah. A couple of comments in the room that it softened it off.
Off the heat, you can take it.
Yeah, could take it.
Full one.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so some people a lot of water in as well.
I think having put a drop of water in there, it really shows more of the stone fruit, which is what you expect from the more modern GlenDronach spirit. And we'll kind of get into how the GlenDronach spirit has evolved over the years, probably on the next whiskey or the whiskey after. But for here, we want to kind of remember anything after 2005 to 2008. We're really, that's where I heard something. We're really producing more of a bright multi-spirit. Thalita is definitely on a mic, isn't she?
Yeah, I'll just send her a message.
Woo!
So, Thalita, I don't know if you're meeting it, but we can hear you. So
Chime in.
Oh, sorry, guys. Hey, everyone. I didn't mean to do that, but I'm here watching, and I wish I was there.
She's muted herself halfway through that sentence. That's all right.
I saw Scott's finger. She did not. She's back. She's fighting through it.
Hey, I have a fever. I'm allowed to be spastic tonight.
Hot mics, live streaming.
Yep. That's it. I think that's the one of the biggest takeaways from live streaming and the recorded element of them is brand ambassadors realizing that everything they say is there for eternity.
Yeah.
And even if it's not live streamed, that I have it on a hard drive for eternity, should I ever need a favor at some point.
You've always had that hard drive, mind you.
True.
I guess before we get too quickly into all the whiskey, something I want to kind of tell you about GlenDronach is the scale of the way things operate, because it is quite a nice synergy to the chaos that we're currently experiencing just with this half virtual. Is Scott going to bring that? Hey, this is perfect for the scale of GlenDronach. It's a distillery that produces about 2 million liquid litres a year. You may think that sounds like a lot. That's a lot in Australian whiskey terms, but compared to our probably biggest competitor, Macallan, they're producing about 25 to 30 times what we are. So we are still exactly what we like to be, which is a small niche distillery. And I think I've experienced no better example of that. And this is the story that I literally promised someone in Scotland I would tell them. When I was last visiting, which was very, very lucky, was actually last year, just in January last year, I managed to scoot across. I was staying at the distillery and I woke up one morning to a sheep licking my window. Thought, it's a unique experience. I'm staying at the distillery, there's a sheep licking my window. I'm sure his name was Dron or Ach. That's what people kept saying. And woke up, got out in my wellies and started marching around the distillery looking for the sheep and kind of forgot about it. And then started walking around. We started looking at the water source, kind of the whole production cycle of GlenDronach. And as we turned down from the water source, the sheep's behind me again. And he's looking very suspicious. He doesn't really do too much until he gets himself caught in some barbed wire. And we go, we can't leave a sheep stuck in that barbed wire. He's gonna knock himself out. So we started trying to shoo the sheep, and we shoo it kind of back into the distillery area. And then we have to do the opposite. We have to get it out of the distillery area, but not into the barbed wire. And by the time we do it, we're basically chasing sheep around GlenDronach Distillery, around the visitor centre, around the stills, covered in mud. I stacked it a fair few times, which I think the Scottish team has held a lot of pictures of. And it was just such a sincere experience. And then went to another distillery that we won't name, and we were a touch muddy. And, they had kind of a museum-like feeling to it. I'm sure someone's probably working out what the distillery might be. And it's still a great distillery, produces great whiskey. But when we arrived covered in mud, we did get a little bit of you guys, I hope you're not coming for a tour. This is a bit unhygienic. I just thought, GlenDronach is a very sincere distillery in that it is a little scruffy, it is a little muddy. We do have sheep running around in front of the distillery. We are not polished, and yet we make a very sincere whiskey, and that's kind of what I want to drill in. It is a very sincere whiskey that I'm going to enjoy.
You mentioned there, so I'm going to pick up on it. You're probably hoping people didn't hear, but you mentioned obviously Macallan, and you mentioned the word competitor. Now, I'm going to assume that's in the sense of another distillery that is very historically focused on ex-sherry casks in terms of a flavour profile side of thing. And for me, as working at the oak barrel, there's always been the big three of Macallan, Glenfarclas and GlenDronach as those big three sherry, houses, for lack of a better word. There's others that do sherry casks very, very well, but they were the three that really planted the flag in it, in the 70s and 80s.
Absolutely.
Is that, like, from a distillery's point of view, is that how you see yourselves? You see yourselves as part of that big three?
We definitely see ourselves as someone that plays predominantly with sherry. I wouldn't ever say that we see ourselves as part of a big three. I think we like to see ourselves as kind of on the lower level, kind of fighting up the entire time. And we'd also compare ourselves to distilleries like Tamdu, which are kind of reinventing themselves in the modern era to become a sherry distillery. But also, I mean, half the staff at GlenDronach have worked all around the distilleries in Scotland. We have a lot of respect for everyone involved in every distillery. Oh yeah, that's a perfect image of how secluded we can be. And I think you can see some of the sheep that were harassing me there as well. But yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and we do see ourselves, at least profile-wise, in comparison to Macallan, but we like to think we have a different philosophy on production.
Yeah. For those playing around, the next one we're going to get onto is the 1994 26-year-old. So if you haven't poured it already, probably a good time to pour.
Definitely.
Which is the outlier. I'm just reacting to a comment here, but this is a bit of the outlier of the batch that we're trying.
Absolutely. So this whiskey, and we will move on to it into the room as well. This whiskey is a little different to where we've been and where we're going. This is more of what you would probably call your traditional GlenDronach bomb whiskey. I remember working with one of the brand ambassadors. He always said, that's not a sherry bomb, that's a sherry nuclear warhead. And despite my rather bad Scottish accent, which I'm now realising is being recorded and I'm sure I will hear back, I think they're right. I mean, this is probably the darkest in the entire release. Is everyone going to do the thing? Look how competent you all look. I hope someone's doing it at home. But it is very rich. 1994 has been a funny year for GlenDronach releases. It is often where the really, really dark sherry bombs have come from. And it is really showing some of that kind of pre-closure character. It has got a lot of the funk to it that we love. But while Scott and I were talking about kind of the order of things tonight, I did say the 1994, we could potentially do this one at the end because it is definitely the biggest whiskey on the lineup. But yeah, the peated will probably still knock it out. But goodness, isn't that big? Isn't that farmyardy? Big sherry character. And the fact that this is the second youngest whiskey we're doing tonight, aside from the No Age Statement, is just very, very exciting to me. 1994, 26-year-old Oloroso. And that is the other unique part of this whiskey. While we're sitting in Pedro Jimenez land for basically the rest of this tasting, one big, dark, nutty Oloroso cask is always appreciated.
In terms of Oloroso Pedro Jimenez age, would you say one is better as it gets older than the other in terms of sherry cost?
Just so we can, everyone can hear that question. Very good question from in the room here. Just in terms of the comparison of Oloroso versus Pedro Jimenez, both sherry casks, does one lend itself better to certain types of aging or different lengths of aging?
It's an absolutely great question and something that we get asked kind of internationally quite frequently. But the reality is we've kind of done both. We've got quite a lot of casks from the 70s that are just marked as butts that could either be Pedro Jimenez and Oloroso, and quite a lot of time goes into working out which is which. The reality is they give you very different profiles at the end of the day, but very, very good profiles in terms of our spirit. So we want to have both on hand so we can marry them if we want, and we can keep them apart if we want, and just so we have a more diverse palate when we're marrying casks. So I wouldn't ever say one is better than the other, but quite a lot of effort does go into the cask sourcing these days as well. So we work very closely with a sherry house in Andalusia called Miguel Martin, and we kind of have a custom footprint for what we request from them they obviously offer to the Scotch industry kind of a blueprint, but we come to them with we want our casks toasted to this level, and then we want them filled for this many years. We say a minimum of 2 years, and then we want them sent straight to Scotland and filled as quickly as possible. So there's no kind of preservatives involved in the whole process either. And that's kind of, we're very, very proud of our cask sourcing these days. It's something that we kind of invested a lot of time and money into, and I think a few quite ritzy holidays for a few Scottish men. So it's something that I think really shines still when we have a pure Oloroso or a pure Pedro Jimenez and can actually appreciate the quality of those casks.
It's an interesting jump to go from that 09 into 94. Like that's a significant, regardless of what distillery you're talking about. And obviously GlenDronach had that closure period, but it's a significant jump. We're getting into some old stuff, and it's probably best highlighted by the fact there's a comment coming through on the Zoom chat that says 94 was a good year, as is this whiskey. So we're starting to get into the territory of people drinking whiskey just as old as themselves.
I was going to say, yeah, I mean, it's a scary bridge to cross for half the room, and for the other half of the room, they're like, we already passed my age, buddy, 2 or 3 years ago. So yeah, just someone's pointing at me because they know how old I am. You're going to shout it out when we get to the whiskey? Yeah. No, we won't. Thank you, mate.
That's right. We already know how old Seamus is because we have to ID him every time he comes to the oak barrel. So,
aged like a fine cheese. That's a great question. So there's actually a bit of discussion on where any of this smoke character comes from in GlenDronach. Some writings have that we were doing kind of a light peating with all our floor malting, and some say, which is also correct, that the phenolic compounds are actually just coming from the oak. Both theories have merit. One of the funny things about buying a distillery that has been closed for a few years is it's very frustrating how little was written down. So our global brand ambassador, God, the gardens look good there. They've not looked that good when I was there. Our global brand ambassador actually spent quite a lot of time personally digging into the history, contacting the old master distillers. And we do know that GlenDronach pre-1996 closure was a distillery that leveraged its floor malting, but not for all of its whiskey. So that floor malted barley was malted over a kind of cork, which is, coal, a cork, peat combination, and that would give it this kind of burnt, kind of rich note. But by the same note, anything that's been sat in an Oloroso or a Pedro Jimenez cask for this long does also pick up that phenolic compound. So it's an absolutely great question, but I don't know the answer.
Shout out to Jared as well on the Zoom chat. And if you are on the Zoom watching in, if you want your question just to come to us, just hit all panelists. If you want it to go to everyone, hit all attendees or panelists. I'm seeing a bit of a couple there. But getting a lot of vanilla on this one, which I can understand as well, which is not necessarily something you associate with sherry and fortified, but it's something you very often associate with oak.
Absolutely. Which is a funny thing because there's also a lot of discussion about where GlenDronach was sourcing its cask from in the 90s when it came to the oak source. So was it European oak, which wouldn't be giving us this much vanilla character, but would be giving us some of the tannin and richness that we're also tasting in the whiskey? Or would it be American oak, where we would be getting the vanilla and kind of a stone fruit character, which is also present in this whiskey? So again, it's something that is probably a perplexing non-answer, so sorry on that one. But
yes, you are correct if you get vanilla.
Yeah, no, there's a ton of vanilla. Sorry, waffle. There's Alan McConaughey. But yeah, so the GlenDronach distillery, I guess, in terms of our production in the 90s, this is something that people kind of fable over. And it is something that it should be fabled over. It's a distillery that was doing a lot of their own floor malted barley and putting quite a lot of effort into their spirit. But at this time, it was virtually just going into teachers' blends, and it was kind of being used to bulk up the richness of teachers. And there's nothing wrong with teachers, but it was for that reason that we had this backlog of crazy whiskies that were very focused on one flavour and kind of showing one character. These days, we want to create a whiskey that is only used for single malts, and that's still why you rarely see a GlenDronach in an independent bottling. If you want a single cask GlenDronach, it usually says GlenDronach Distilling Company or Ben Riach Distilling Company on the label. And that's something we're pretty proud of. We can kind of control and show off what we like best about our spirit. Goodness.
In terms of the ratio of, getting back to that Oloroso, Pedro Jimenez, European, American oak thing, because they are highlighted most prominently in single cask form, aren't they?
Yeah.
You know, when you get a revival 15-year-old or something like that, you're getting a mixture of PX and Oloroso. You're getting a mixture of wood sources probably. So this is the best way to highlight and see exactly what they do. Do you have any idea? Like I'm obviously, particularly the Australian allocation, or the ones that were given to our part of the world this year, there was a lot of PX. If we go back 5, 6, 7 years, a lot of them are Oloroso. Is that a change, and what are we, seeing more PX as a trend into the future, or what's sort of the trend there?
It's a great question. I think
I pay him to say that, by the way.
Yeah, sorry. It's like day one media training. They tell you to say it's a great question after every question.
But then also they tell you, say, that's a really great question. Then you answer the question you want to answer, not the question that you asked. So in this case,
as I was saying, Scott,
let's hold him to the question that I actually asked.
Unfortunately, the best casks for the single cask are the ones that taste the best. It's not whether they're Pedro Jimenez or Oloroso, and the production is kind of still reflecting that. Obviously, these days, Pedro Jimenez is becoming slightly more prominent in the sherry production, but I don't know too much. Well, I don't know enough about sherry to kind of talk about the trends of PX versus Oloroso and that side of things. The reality is we're sourcing what we think tastes best and what we think will taste best in 12 years, 20 years, 25 years. And then to do that classic media training part, a big part of what we're doing our sourcing for these days is just first fill. We are very rarely filling any GlenDronach spirit into second fill, third fill, fourth fill. Well, I don't think we're ever filling it for fourth fill, but second fill, because we want to have the biggest, most intense flavour in our GlenDronach casks immediately. And then as soon as those are depleted, or we empty them to put in the 12, the 15, the 18, we are then transferring them over to the sister distilleries of Benriach or Glenglassaugh, where longer maturation is occurring and they can sit there a little longer, and we want it to be ready when it's 30 or 40, not when it's 15, 18 or 20. How's that?
So very, very well done.
Thanks.
Answered your own question, but didn't answer, so we have no idea.
Yeah.
But essentially the cast will tell us which ones taste better.
Yeah, I mean, it is literally just what's best.
That's pretty smart, I think. There's a bit going on there. Even as, moving my mouth and talking, you can feel the flavours, sort of mix around my mouth and start to develop a little bit. I'm getting more and more of that sort of tobacco leaf smoke that I think was mentioned before. The longer it goes, the more I'm getting that, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, I think it's really sitting very comfortably in like roasted coffee beans territory as well. It is just dark and rich, and a lot of people, when we tried this before, described it as the GlenDronach 18 on steroids, and I don't think that's an unfair assessment at all. The reality is the GlenDronach 18 has probably sourced a lot of casks from this era of production in Oloroso.
Quick g'day to some people tuning in: James Finnegan, Dave and/or Caroline Taylor, regulars of our various social media feeds. G'day to all of you tuning in there.
I'm going to grab some water.
Grab some water. Yeah. I think that image that is up there now, that's probably for me the most iconic GlenDronach image. It's that sort of scarlet burgundy, not quite burgundy, but scarlet red against the grey of the distillery. And I think it's probably fair to say these are obviously images approved by GlenDronach, taken by GlenDronach, approved by GlenDronach in its finest light. But GlenDronach, when you rock up, is not the sexiest distillery in the world, is it?
How dare you? Yes,
but it's like, and there's a lot of distilleries that make excellent whiskey and therefore sexy and luxurious and look really cool because they make excellent whiskey. But if they made, like chicken feed, they wouldn't be as exciting.
Yeah.
So like if you made chicken feed in that building, I'm probably not going to go visit it for, its architectural sort of thing. But that for me is iconic. GlenDronach, as someone who's been there and spent a bit of time there, what's the distillery like in terms of a punter rocking up? we can't go and do that right now. So
I can say anything. It's Disneyland for whiskey. No, it kind of is though. It's an exciting place to go to. It's basically, GlenDronach is surrounded by its old kind of maturation houses and its warehouses where we're still stacking barrels to this day. It's still all matured on site for GlenDronach, with the exception of an odd cask every here or there that we don't own anymore, that's being matured by Pernod or something. And I mean, there's almost no reason someone would be rolling a barrel from the old peating room to the distillery or vice versa, but it's a hell of a picture, isn't it?
It takes a bloody good photo, I'll tell you that.
But it is a beautiful distillery, and we have just invested quite a lot of time into this whole experience, which is actually visiting and really being a part of it. Part of visiting a distillery that maybe was independently owned or didn't have that much money poured into it in the past was obviously, it was quite an authentic experience, but you're also kind of tripping over wires, doing a lot of health and safety issues, and maybe weren't allowed in a lot of areas for that reason. So we've very much reinvented it and kind of rebuilt it so that we have all these features of the area kind of as a part of it. So as you walk in, the visitor centre is a bar built out of slate where you can sample whiskies from the 1970s, 80s and 90s and 2000s and are greeted by some professional hosts. And then you get taken around the distillery, and it is a beautiful distillery to go around. If you go back to that courtyard shot, now putting pressure on him here.
So just why we had a bit of a technical thing, and everyone's seen my desktop background a few times, is the plan was to have Thalita on that screen tonight. So this is a very quick 5 minutes before you walked in and went live. Quickly, can we find every image ever taken of GlenDronach to use the greatest TV of all time?
And we could.
Yeah, so we got there.
And thank God they were high res, because that is a big TV. But yeah, all right. So looking at that image on the right-hand side of it, we're starting to look at kind of the malting floors of yesteryear. And you can kind of see the chimney just in the top of that image of where it would lead. And then to the left, we're coming into the still house. So if you walk straight in, you get past the Porteous mill, which some people get very funny about, but it's basically an old mill that we still use to this day for grinding our barley before it goes into the production where it starts to ferment and become a beer. And then basically, yeah, we are walking into, oh God, there's got to be some good images of it somewhere, but we need to fire through them.
Stills, I like stills.
Still house. This is an absolutely beautiful still house. It's built in the old school way before any kind of air conditioning existed, where if the stills were getting too hot and your spirit was getting a little too crazy in the still, you would just open the windows. Old school air conditioning. It's pretty civilized. And then just below those stills, you can see where they used to heat them with direct fire. Those coal fire stills have now been replaced with steam heating. The very big reason for that is you burn through a lot of copper by doing coal heating on your stills, which isn't a surprise when you say it out loud. Direct coal on direct copper, you're probably going to get some hot spots. You're probably going to burn some holes in some copper. I think GlenFarclas is one of the few distilleries, maybe the only, that does coal heating. Springbank
on one of their stills. And there's a bunch of new guys coming through that are playing around with it.
Hipsters.
Yeah. Can't keep up with them.
But GlenFarclas famously replaced their still more often than anyone else in the industry for that reason. So we've switched to steam heating to give us more consistent flavour on the spirit and get a little more mileage on our copper. And yeah, I mean, that's pretty much the view of the Glen House and the surrounding stables. If you ever visit the distillery, you can stay there on site. It's a pretty amazing experience.
I think we should move on to whiskey number 3, but I have to say I'm enjoying this challenge that I'm throwing at Seamus tonight. To basically, it's a little bit like one of those where, one of those tests where someone comes in and is like, what do you think this image looks like? And it's like that black and white image. I have about 150 images that are just labelled GlenDronach 1 to 150. I have no idea what they're of. So we're just going to keep rolling through and throwing Seamus under the bus to see what he can talk about.
Look, it's fine by me. I mean, Thalita and I definitely worked out what we were going to say tonight. And yeah, it's...
and now we're letting the whiskies do the talking.
Yeah, exactly. Whiskey number 3, we're letting the whiskies do the talking.
So we are going to 1992, the 27-year-old, which is 49.2%. I'm going to bring this up now. Oh, it's down pat, absolutely down pat.
Smashed it. That wasn't an accident at all.
Yeah.
Cask number 6049, sorry. This is a fairly low ABV single cask, and that's kind of what I want to focus on while we discuss this, because obviously when you mature for longer, you're going to get a little bit of a change in character from when you're first sticking it in. So generally in the Scottish industry, you see casks dropping in ABV just because more alcohol is evaporating than water. I think everyone has kind of heard that chat once or twice. Conversely, in Australia, obviously, if we're maturing any whiskey here, alcohol in the cask is climbing because more water is evaporating. One of the kind of unique things that we discovered in the Australian industry, and we discovered for a terrible reason, was kind of the chemistry of why casks do this specific flavour at an older age. I'll just pause there to kind of go the flavour. It's kind of a bright stone fruit character. Some people call it tropical. It definitely shows as tropical a little more in a bourbon cask. And we discovered kind of the cause of this in the Australian industry for a fairly negative reason. So when the Nant guys were filling casks at 40% alcohol and then water was evaporating, it was starting to climb between 40 and 50, and it was coming out with some of this character, a really bright sugary character. And eventually a few boffins at Lark kind of put together that one of the reasons for this was the character that you're going to get from wood at a lower ABV is more of this bright white sugar, and it's purely just coming from the wood and the proof of the alcohol at the time. And whether at a higher ABV, you're going to get a lot more dark, rich character. So any of the casks in this lineup, especially that are above 50, probably 52, do generally show quite a dark character. Any that are closer to 50 or below 50 show quite a bright character. So does anyone get anything really different from this one? This is quite different to most GlenDronach single casks I've had, especially 1992s. Yeah, bananas. Bananas is a great example of what I'm talking about. It's a lot brighter and sugarier than whiskies of yesterday. Yes, at the back.
I can tell you what it looks like. That helps you.
Yeah?
So in my, I see this picture, so in my head, when you smell it, it looks like a pineapple, but when you drink it, it looks like a blondie, which is like a brownie that tastes like
a white chocolate brownie? Like a...
Kind of.
That's so cool.
Your number two looks like emerald green.
That, can I have you next to me in all tastings? That's fantastic. Oh, then we'll get something really abstract.
Hey, remember how I said I nailed it before?
You didn't, did you? You did the other 1992?
No, I had the 93 up.
Oh, great.
I definitely picked, because there's two 92s in this thing, but I put the 93 up. We're on the 92, which is what we're drinking.
You're a rat bag. What do you get out of this one, Scott?
Heaps of that tropical fruit, like heaps. I mean, maybe it's in comparison to that 94 that that was coming through. That was so industrious and so, workhorse.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is really vibrant.
And
I see that white chocolate thing from up the back there, but also like rock melon and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, definitely. I think this is also really shocking to have come from in 1992. I don't know if anyone else has had many 1992 single casks from us in recent years, but they're generally kind of high ABV thumpers, like big Oloroso cask whiskies. And generally we chalk a lot of the kind of darker character to that up to an additional percentage of floor malting being in the barley. As I said, floor malting, you're getting your peat, you're getting your coal, that character in the whiskey. It seems like this whiskey has a fairly low ratio of floor malting in the production process because it is fairly actually barley forward given how old it is. We're still quite bright and like that candy from cold barley snaps. I feel like Alice at the back has kind of stomped on anyone else coming out with any kind of impressive tasting notes because she can see the flavor. That's so awesome.
That's good. Yeah, I'm being yelled at in the Zoom chat at the moment because everyone drank their 93 instead of their 92. So I do apologise. Definitely my stuff up. But Corey jumps in. The 5896 from 92 was a cracker. I agree if anyone remembers that, but it was very different to this as well.
Totally opposite end of the spectrum. And I think that's actually why it's going to be quite good to go from the 92 to the 93 to the 90. where they're all Pedro Jimenez casks, because this is going to be a fun comparison, I think. But at the same time, this is very clearly a Pedro Jimenez cask. It is very sugar forward. It is very bright and very heavy. It has probably less syrupy character than you'd expect. Has anyone here actually been to the GlenDronach distillery?
Yep.
When did you go?
2011.
Goodness. Can you tell the room a little bit of what it was like in 2011? I'm going to walk over to you with a lapel mic.
This is going to be a disaster.
No, I was quite impressed with it. It was interesting to see where the old coal-fired part was and that. And yeah, had a good time. Was there, then left there and went to Glengarry.
Oh, Glengarry's, yeah, it's very close by, isn't it? It's a beautiful distillery, and I'm glad you kind of had that experience before the renovations as well, just because it is the same distillery, but a little less polished and a little more Australian a little bit. It's kind of grunty.
Jared on the Zoom chat visited the distillery in 2017, but wasn't in a group, so couldn't do a tour, but had a good look around the shop and bought a few things.
Is there a number chasing sheep around?
Yeah. That's probably why the distillery was closed. Yeah, someone's chasing sheep.
It's a daily occurrance.
But is Jared not the greatest distillery visitor ever? What did you tour? The gift shop. Normally they have to take you through the whole distillery, get you a little bit pissed, and get you back through, exit through the gift shop thing. But Jared, you've done it very well there, mate. I think when borders open and we can get back over there, it would be a few distilleries rolling out the red carpet to you.
Yeah, you're not wrong there, Scott.
I'm going to pick up the 93 in a separate glass while we're here. We can maybe do these ones reasonably side by side.
Let's do this together.
Which is because they're both 27-year-olds.
Both 27 years of age.
Obviously, the month in which you distill and the month you bottle can play an impact on whether you can call it whatever year it is. And that's how we essentially divide up the 292s from this outturn, because one's a 27-year-old, one was distilled a little bit earlier in the year, so therefore makes a 28-year-old. But the two we're doing tonight is a 27-year-old. So for those of you who I threw the absolute googly to on the Zoom chat, maybe you can give me your first impressions of the 93 and how different it is to the 92.
That's a great point. And while we're getting into it, this is completely different to the last one, isn't it? So Scott's actually right. Obviously, the time of the year definitely plays a part in how these casks are marked up. But in this case, it's actually the 1992 was pulled out because it was dropping in ABV and it was ready. We couldn't risk losing any more proof and it kind of mellowing out anymore. So it was pulled out quite a lot earlier than any of the other casks in this batch, interestingly. This one is obviously quite a lot richer, quite a lot darker.
It's closer to the 94 and to that classic, what I expect when I pick up a GlenDronach single cask.
Absolutely.
I think the 94 certainly was a little bit grittier, a little bit more industrious. This is prettier.
Yes,
this is more elegant.
So 51%, 1993. This is sitting fairly comfortably around where most of the 1993 casks are coming out these days. And it is still a fairly even split on 93 on PX and all the rest. So at least of the casks that I've seen in Australia.
Menthol.
Yeah.
Lots of menthol on the 93. Which I kind of love. You know how everyone's got their own histories, everyone grew up in different places and walked past different trees on the way to school. Not everyone hung around in footy sheds rubbing Denker rub on themselves and other people.
What?
So I did a bit of that in my youth. And one thing that I really get a lot is menthol, is that sort of that vibrant, that smell of, footy sheds after a loss. And that's what.
Why after a loss? That makes it so much worse.
The Denker rub is always more potent after a loss. Because everything hurts more. You need to apply more.
Oh, God.
Can you tell the difference between a menthol and the bean smell? Well, how would you describe it?
So good question there. Difference between menthol and phenol smells. Menthol smells like Denker rub. But it's got that mintiness, that sort of like cooling element. Not that it's necessarily cooling, but that sort of, particularly in your nose hairs, that sort of. I mean, people might not say Denkerub, they might say Fisherman's Friend. You know, I'm going to say the overproof Mentos, but you know the.
What's the matter with you?
Because everything I do is through the prism of whiskey. So you know, like they released those double mint Mentos back in the day, and they were just like you couldn't taste anything, but like that sort of sensation. And it's much a sensation as it is a flavour for me.
And it is actually hanging out with that sensation. I do feel cool on the tongue, but I think my main takeaway on this whiskey is actually the mouthfeel. It is much more viscous than the last one, even with just that 2 extra proof. It's sticking to my tongue a lot more. And personally, I actually love a bright, sweet, fruity kind of twist on GlenDronach, just because you never get it. This is kind of back to home base. This is what you expect, but it still does it so damn well.
It kind of smells like sultana bread.
Sultana
bread.
Sultana bread.
Like when you first smelt it, it had that sugary sultana-ness. Like, you know when you soak sultana in alcohol, and it gets that sugariness coming through, and then you taste it, and then your mouth's numb, and then it gets bready, and you're like, sultana bread.
So an excellent comment from here for those who may not have picked that up on the mics, but Sultana brand, which was a great way to start the conversation or start the sentence, and it was like, you know how you mix Sultana brand with alcohol? So again, tasting notes for the prism of mixing whiskey for breakfast and everything. But like has that sort of that fibery sort of grainy note to it as well.
I think water's just opened this one up brilliantly, by the way. Just a drop, for me, that's absolutely brought out quite a chunk more of the sherry character.
But like these, obviously with the single casks, we get a bit of information. We get, the type of sherry, which obviously we should get. We get dates of bottling, we get cask numbers and that sort of thing. But on spec, these are 2 sherry cask matured 27-year-old cask strength GlenDronachs. Now, there's distilleries out there that's all the information arguably you would get on a bottle is age, the type of oak, not necessarily the type of fortified that went into it, and the ABV. And I think this is a great example of these are 2 completely different whiskies, and not that you would necessarily know what they tasted like by reading the day it was distilled and the day it was bottled. But I think that's an excellent indicator of, on the spec, kind of the same whiskey from the same distillery, but 2 completely different results.
Absolutely. I think this has actually turned into a spectacular lineup. If anyone still has anything left in that first whiskey, or even if they can smell the glass, that has absolutely just crisped up to like a bright apple character now. Like that's really showing the spirit that was in there. And funnily, it's almost actually blackberry, and that's actually what GlenDronach Spirit tastes like these days. Just coming off the still. If anyone's had the pleasure of trying it at the distillery, or whenever we were able to shamble around with a spray bottle of it or a touch of a glass of it, it really was that kind of blackberry apple kind of character that you had in those juice boxes when you were a kid, and it is damn near addictive. I think I left the house smelling like that far too often. I thought I smelled like apples and fruits, and I probably left smelling like an alcoholic. But
again, all our tasting notes through the prism of drinking whiskey all the time. Just a note on that, like a lot of people in this room here and at this tasting watching along may not know the DNA of the GlenDronach new make. Now, aside from necessarily those fruits and those flavour profiles, to fight for 27, 28 years in these sherry casks, it needs to be reasonably bulky. It needs to have a bit of muscularity to it. I know, is muscularity a word? Probably not, but there we go.
All tasting notes through the prism of
whiskey. Can you taste that at 1 day old?
It doesn't kick you in the mouth like you would almost expect for 1 day old. It needs to stand up against an enormous sherry cask, but then it lingers in the mouth for so long that you can see how that could be able to fight it. And it is why we can use those first fill sherry casks 100% of the time with GlenDronach, because it is just there broiling ready for it. Whether Ben-Riach, if we are using a first fill sherry cask, it's usually for a secondary maturation, because a bourbon cask or a virgin oak cask or something has already not virgin oak, a bourbon cask has already given it a backbone, and then a sherry cask is just coming in over the top and giving it a little more character if we want to do that.
We find out what colour it tastes like.
Yes, absolutely. Can this be a segment?
It doesn't look like a colour. It looks like a very specific thing. I'm sorry. There's a Burke Street bakery brownie when you soak the dates in sherry for enough for 3 days. And it looks like that specific brownie.
Wow.
So for those playing at home, we are running along on this theme of what colour does it look like, and in Sydney there's quite a major street, one of the arteries of Surrey Hills, obviously named after the English town of Surrey, where Joseph Foveaux came from as an early settler, which is obviously where Foveaux Street comes from. But so in Surrey Hills, obviously it's spelled a little bit different because we lost the E through history. But there is a bakery that's quite famous called Burke Street Bakery on that street, and I'm not a particular frequenter of that bakery,
No,
but apparently there's a date-soaked.
A brownie that has dates soaked in sherry for 3 days.
A brownie that has dates
Soaked in sherry.
for 3 days, and that's the same colour, the particular shade of this whiskey.
So it tastes like that colour, right?
It tastes like that thing.
Yeah, right. Sorry, we should stop saying colour. We're not helping you
It
here.
tastes like a memory or a thing or a place. It's a good time.
This is great. Does it smell like something? No, I'm not going to get us down this road. What does everyone think of this compared to whiskey number 3? Or for everyone on video, reverse the question, but which was the pick, the 92 or the 93?
93.
Fantastic.
Bit divided initially, but then a few 3s coming through, 93s at the end there. I really like that 92 because it's so different.
Yeah. We might be jaded.
Nadia, 93. Corey, 93. Jared, 92. Dennis, 93.
Oh, fantastic.
So just in that small sample group from the Zoom chat, and I haven't had a chance to look at the Facebook there. Paul, love the fruits on the 92. Different Paul, 93. Yeah, about maybe a third 92 to 2/3 93.
Yeah, I think that's actually not a surprise. 93 is a traditional GlenDronach single cask. I should stay on this picture for a second, actually.
Just before you talk about this picture, the air conditioning, you just mentioned something there. 93 is a traditional year for single cask. Now, there is a bit of a myth of the 93s, and as a punter, as a drinker, it's just been that the 93s have been excellent. Was there anything specific going on that we know of? We know that wasn't a huge amount being written, being communicated at that point, but...
Yeah, so for anyone who hasn't maybe seen it, we've even acknowledged this kind of infamy around 93 by releasing a vintage 1993 release 2 years ago now, which is 25-year-old, which is still floating around a tiny bit in Australia, but it's something around 1993 casks from people, especially focused on kind of the first 3 months of the year, of it being something infamous and just of outstanding quality. And basically the only thing that we can kind of plug into potentially why the whiskies from those era are being picked as exceptional so frequently is barley shortages. There was a running load of barley shortages from 1992 to 1993, and there was one around that period of time that these casks are coming from. And what that has basically done to the production cycle is there was less barley to buy, so we had to rely more on our own floor maltings for barley production. So potentially just the production crew was a little more hands-on with the additional step of production, and that's yielded a maybe not exceptional, but maybe different or standing out kind of character. But onto this, and I'm not going to talk about air conditioning because I already did, but thank you.
Yeah, so why blue?
It's actually not blue, that's just the photo. It's got a weird lens on it. Or maybe it was then, but it wasn't when I visited. Something you will notice about these stills, maybe looking at them if you have seen any other distillery stills, is they are quite short and fat. And that's completely by design. For anyone who doesn't know, basically a decent rule of thumb is the higher it has to go to get out of that copper surface, and I'm sorry, I'm going to stand up, but the higher it has to go to get out of here, the more it's going to touch copper, and is Scott doing it with a mouse? Oh, perfect. The more it's going to interact with the copper and kind of strip away some of the richer, darker flavors. The richer character of it. So we're trying to minimize the distance it has to travel, minimize the reflux, and basically trying to capture the spirit in its richest form possible. And basically that's our production at every step. We're trying to compound that. So it's a fairly short ferment because we don't want it to burn off all of the proteins in there. And then when we're brewing it, we're adding yeast that kind of extenuate that kind of darker character. And then distilling it again, we're trying to go heavy and dark. And then finally casks, we're trying to go heavy and dark. So it's all kind of a layered approach to whiskey production instead of just doing it this way and finishing it in 200 different kinds of whiskey and telling everyone that we're amazing.
Question there, do they need to take smaller cuts with shorter stills?
That's actually an absolutely great question that I don't particularly know the answer to in general industry, but I know in terms of GlenDronach's production cycle, we take fairly industry standard cuts. I couldn't give you the exact proofs that they're coming on and off at, actually. Don't know if you've had a Goog and it's in your back of your head.
No, I mean 63.5 filling strength, but actual running off the still strength, I'm not too sure. But I actually don't think you would almost take wider cuts with a long still. I mean, no, notoriously one of the smallest cuts in Scotland is Auchentoshan, who triple distill because they just want the finest points. If you're going to all the effort of whether you're an Auchentoshan or a Glenmorangie with very tall, thin stills, that you want to get a really refined spirit, you want to take if you're making a refined spirit, then you want to keep that refinement. So you want to take the cleanest heart possible. If you're going for a short squat still with some of those heavy volatiles are carrying over, you're not doing that because you want to really refine beautiful spirits. So every distillery is obviously going to be a little bit different, but in general, you're probably going to be a little bit lean, like a little bit looser, and let a lot of those heavy volatiles in because that's probably what you're going to need for the sherry cask.
Yeah.
Famously, an Australian distillery, and I know there's a lot of differences between Australia and Scotland, but our friends out at Mendur and Blackgate take a very, very late cut on their spirit. Almost to the point where the negative flavours are coming through. And talking to Brian, the distiller there, he described it as keep the faith, because you're tasting and smelling the stuff coming off and it's going, well, this is actually not particularly pleasant. But they know in that crazy 40-degree days, 5-degree nights in those barrels, they're just going to cook, and those really heavy flavours that may not be particularly pleasant now, they're gone in 6 months. So they need to keep those in. So I dare say, as a general rule, that you'd be looking for those wider cuts.
Yeah, you've actually just completely jogged my memory. So yeah, GlenDronach does start probably a full whack later than Benriach or Glenglasser does in terms of our portfolio, and it does also finish later. And as Scott said, yeah, we want to be hanging out at the back end where we're getting a little bit of umami character, just a touch coming from the spirit.
Very, very good. Shall we move on to whiskey number 5, which is our climax for single cask tonight?
Absolutely.
So this is, regardless of what goes up on the screen right now, it is the 1990, the 30-year-old.
So this is a very special whiskey, I guess, for us to be able to be drinking. It's been quite a while since we've had a 30-year-old single cask from GlenDronach in Australia. And probably one of the benefits, I guess, of the distillery getting a little further away from the 90s means a lot of the 90s production that we actually have decent stocks of is aging up and doing these miraculous things in the cask. And this is another, it smells aged in the room, and that is a very, very fair statement. It is not the darkest whiskey tonight, but it is kind of showing in character its age. We are getting a lot of leather, a lot of funk.
And before you say too much on that, and before the its age comment came through, our Tasmanian friend Whiskey is My Jam may have said new shoe leather on the 09. His first tasting note, straight off the bat, as soon as the image went up, was nose of the 1990 is old shoe leather. So we've gone from new shoe leather to old shoe leather tonight. And you thought we were going to take you on a magical mystery tour, but all we've done is talk about shoes for an hour.
From a whiskey point of view.
Everything through the prism of whiskey. I do actually need to get some leather shoes repaired. So
whiskey show.
So maybe I go in and be like,
leather shoes.
hey mate, like these are smelling pretty 1990 right now. Can you turn them into a 209?
That's a bang on comparison. This is actually presenting as a little tighter on the nose, but I think it's going to open up quite nicely as kind of we let it breathe. What's everyone's first impression on this whiskey?
I think for me, you just nailed it. Like, there's definitely that old element. Like, you can tell when something, and it's not just a whiskey thing. You can tell when an Armagnac or a cognac or something is old, it's got that dustiness to it. But it does feel a little bit tight. I think this needs a bit of water, or at least a bit of time. Nadia's coming through with fruitcake on the chat there.
Oh, fantastic! It is plenty of fruitcake, and I might actually do it just a dab of water, but. Again, in proof, we're kind of hanging around the 50% alcohol, which is honestly pretty impressive for a 30-year-old single cask. They quite often drop a fair touch lower than that.
Just there was a question on the Zoom chat, I think, that I ignored a little while ago just because I am a bad person. But it was asked Seamus about the high ABV, low ABV effects on aging.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so in terms of obviously that 2009 that we had, that was 59.2, so close or there enough to 60% alcohol. From there, we've gone down and everything's been around the 50% mark. That 09, if you had left it in the cask, end up something like this, or?
I mean, it's so hard to know where it would have gone. Obviously, the spirit's coming from a completely different year and a completely different kind of production team, but it's definitely going to follow the same trend. I think Thalita was referring to the maturing whiskey where it's climbing in ABV versus reducing in ABV, and we kind of already covered that a little bit with the Nant stuff, but I think it's always important when you're at least evaluating whiskey, if you can't taste it, to look at the cask proof, because it's going to give us such a clear indication of, well, not clear, but at least an indication of where the whiskey is going to roughly be hanging out. And I think at this lower proof, there is obviously a mountain load of sherry in this whiskey. It is hanging out very comfortably in sherry territory, but it is also carrying some of the character of that 1992 that we enjoyed. There is just a touch of that brightness hanging between all the rich sugars. There's just like a strawberry thing going on in there.
It smells like when the barrels at the front that you have of your fortified, if you smell the wood that's being soaked with that fortified, that's what it smells like. And that's what it's tasting like, just fortified wood.
Yeah. So like fortified wine barrels, and I dare say whiskey barrels as well, because we do have a few up the front. You haven't been to the Oak Barrel watching on the stream. We've got a few out the front. There is that bit of a pang when you walk in the store, but I think it's more than, I think it's walking into a barrel house or a rick house or wherever, anywhere in the world. It's got that element. It almost seems to, and I don't know if anyone else gets this sensation when you walk into a warehouse full of barrels, is it feels like it's coming from the ground.
Yeah.
You know it's coming from the barrels, but it's almost those, and whether it's an earth floor or a concrete floor or whatever it is, but particularly with earth floors, you feel like it's almost the bits that have dropped in the ground coming back up.
Absolutely. There is always, and it actually applies at the GlenDronach Distillery too, because we do have quite a bit of dunnage maturation, which is the old school Scottish style where the barrels are only stacked 3 high. Test for Scotty, nailed it.
Oh, I'm getting better at this.
And it is on those pebbles, and you can obviously access the casks a little more difficultly, but it is more traditional, and we have a mixture of the two at the distillery, but this is what is covering the largest footprint. And what you do really get when you walk in is you can almost smell what's evaporating off the casks. Obviously on a cold day it's awful and it's cold, but when it's warmer, when it's summer, when there's a little more heat in the air, this actually applies as well at Australian distilleries. If anyone's ever been to like Lark, they've obviously got dunnage maturation, even if it isn't a big tin shed. you do get kind of, it is almost like evaporation, but reverse, you're feeling it go up.
Paul HB is coming through on the Zoom chat there. Sweet, dark fruity, viscous, oily, easily the best one so far. Christmas fruitcake soaked in brandy.
Who agrees with that? Best one so far. Oh.
I think...
you can't see how many people agreed with you, so I'm going to say a lot.
Yeah. It was at least 25% of the room. Well, Nadia seems to agree, but I think that's a good point that we haven't touched on too much with these whiskies, apart from the menthol Dinka rub experience we had a little while ago, is the texture and the viscousness and the oiliness of this whiskey. And it's very, and it's a word I overuse quite a lot when I'm talking about whiskey, is stately. It's a really stately, leathered armchair sort of whiskey.
I've never heard you say stately. It's been a year, I guess.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. Once a year is probably too much, to be fair. So.
A little bit of molasses.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was going to say icing sugar, like a little bit of that icing sugar dusting across that Christmas fruitcake soaked in brandy that Paul was talking about, 100%, but then just like a light dusting of icing sugar as well on it, and molasses coming in from the room here as well.
So this is probably the whiskey that I really get to sit on. We're pretty bloody lucky to be able to have a 30-year-old single cask right here, right now. I think. Obviously, 30 years of age is an age that is going to get harder and harder for the industry kind of as we plug on. But especially in the 1990s, especially this distillery, I think it's a distillery that almost shouldn't be able to present to us what's going on. I mean, GlenDronach is a distillery that was closed in 1996. It was properly mothballed, and it was eventually revived, but it was revived in a bit of a heartless way, and it's since come back to prominence. And I think we were so at risk of just this distillery joining like Imperial and Patelin and Brora as distilleries that we talk about, but we don't get to drink anymore. And the fact that we can sit in a room and actually have a single cask 30-year-old whiskey and not pay an arm and a leg for it is something that gets me a bit giddy about all this.
It depends on your definition of arm and a leg, but yeah, I agree.
I lost mine years ago paying for whiskies.
Cameron.
What was it reopened?
GlenDronach Distillery was, when was it reopened was the question. GlenDronach Distillery was reopened in May, June 2002. And from that point onwards, they produced similarly sherry cask style whiskies till about 2005, and then it kind of transferred over to being a brighter, lighter distillery for a couple of years. Those casks have either been taken on their way by the prior owners, or they were immediately finished in sherry casks and done for the rest of the maturation when Billy Walker took the distillery back. So you will very rarely see a bourbon cask GlenDronach these days.
Bit of a question that you might, because we've got another whiskey to go and we'll get onto that in a second, but I just put up the image of batch 18 of GlenDronach single cask. Now, there's a few of them there.
Yeah.
And there's, but I think it was a couple of years ago, they started to be divided up into different markets or not different regions rather. So we saw 8, I think, was it 8 this time around?
Seven
this time around, 5 of which we've tried tonight. The other ones were another
12-year-old. There was a 2008.
There was a 2008 12-year-old, and then there was another 92.
There was a 92.
That's right, the 92 28-year-old
which was an Oloroso. And if anyone's curious about that whiskey and hasn't had the chance to try it, it is kind of the opposite side of the spectrum to the 92 that we enjoyed tonight. So this one's lighter, brighter, and a sweeter whiskey, and the opposite 92 is a much lower yield, and it is a very dark, rich, syrupy. I think it's 57 ABV, so it's hanging out in the same territory as the 1994 that we had tonight.
Yeah. So in terms of taking this back a step, is there any thought process put into which whiskies go to which market, or is it just, okay, we've got 3 93s, one goes there, one goes there, one goes there? Because I know, and if we're talking about Australian dollars, in the last year, the Scotch industry lost about $2 billion in exports. And a lot of people, American tariffs were a big part of that. I think it was about 25% dropped off in America. Australia, comparatively, we lost about 3%. So we went down, but we did, and I think we're the 8th biggest market now for Scotch whisky exports.
Yeah.
But that's in terms of value, not in terms of volume. So I think Australia, and I don't know if we see it domestically, but certainly when you speak to people in Scotland, Australia is a market, they drink a lot of whiskey, but they drink a lot of premium Scotch.
Yeah.
So the Scotch market goes like that. Do we see, is that something you think goes on in the thought process about when it's divided up? Because we're with the Middle East, I think, and Asia and Australia.
Yeah. It's absolutely a great question. Damn it, I gotta stop doing that. Sorry.
Now he's going to answer something else. So.
I would love to say that there's like a League of Nations and me and the me's from other countries all come along and kind of say, well, I want these casks, but I want these casks. But it's not quite that romantic. It is very much Rachel selects the casks that she believes are the best and showing the best character, and then we try and avoid putting, say, 1992 Pedro Jimenez casks in the same market. We always want to have a PX versus an Oloroso if there is the same year going in, just because the whole point of this is really to show the diversity and character of the distillery, and we wouldn't really be doing our job if we delivered things that at least on paper looked very similar. And then beyond that, it's really a expression of how strong the markets are. And as Scott was saying, Australia is an incredibly strong market for Scotch in general, but then for GlenDronach, we're currently sitting at 5th in the world. So we're kind of overplaying even compared to where we should be in the industry. And then that's kind of a quite recent jump. We've jumped pretty heavily just because Australians have kind of fallen in love again with the 12-year-old, the 15-year-old, the 18 and the 21-year-old, all those things that people buy that let us get these things and try these things and drink them all.
It sort of fits the trend. I remember it would have been a decade ago. I'm not working at the Oak Barrel, but I'm coming to these tastings, and my predecessor, Dave Withers, was a big champion of GlenDronach, and it was stuff that I'd never tried before, these single casks, and it just sort of fit into the Australian psyche and Australian taste palette of big. You know, I don't know the figures of Bruichladdich, but I would love to see where we are, not in Bruichladdich, but in Octomore.
Yeah.
You know, we love our big smoky whiskies. We like our big sweet whiskies. We like our big sherry whiskies. It's almost a little bit more difficult to break more subtle whiskies into this market.
Definitely.
So it doesn't surprise me at all that in terms of the great scheme of things, a distillery like GlenDronach, that even when it's not doing pure sherry, as we're about to get into, or traditional sherry, everything is big, everything is loud.
Yeah.
You know, even the Highland for a whiskey that wasn't 100% sherry was a loud, big flavoured whiskey.
Absolutely, and I think it's a conversation we have on the opportunities we've had to select casks. We have to say Australians love big, fortified, heavy whiskies, and then often Scott goes, nah, I'll do a whiskey that I like.
Yeah, Linkwood, it's called.
Linkwood, like the Ben Riach 14 rum cask, that was very light and fruity and bright.
Just like me.
Wasn't going to say it, but you're the one rubbing Tiger Balm on people.
Jenka rub. So we might get on to the last whiskey. I'm going to stop the screen share just for a second for everyone watching at home, because I want to put up a little bit of a poll about these 5 whiskies, because everyone's coming, like flooding the chat with both chats, which one was their favourite, and I can't keep up, so I'm going to start a poll for that. But moving away, a bit of dessert essentially from something that is a little bit different, and even though it's been pushed at and there's been a lot of releases like this and in this vein, it's still not something that people necessarily associate GlenDronach with, is this release?
Yeah, absolutely. So Australia is actually one of the only places where we have a fairly steady supply of the peated whiskey. So in the rest of the world, this is very much an oddity, but this is the latest version of the GlenDronach peated, and it is the version that will be sticking around. I know in the past we had done a portwood finish, and prior to that we had a GlenDronach peated, which was on most retail shelves, which is half bourbon, half sherry. So I would often do a whole waffle about how important sherry casks and fortified casks are, and then go, oh, but the bourbon casks in this one are really good too. I don't have to do that anymore because this is sherry and port matured. the story of how this whiskey came to be, I guess, is a bit funny, but as I said, I'm a big believer in you enjoying this while I'm waffling, not after. So I guess in terms of profile, we are looking very much for that Highland peat. The peat source is mainland instead of coastal, so we're going to miss all the iodine, miss all those kind of Isla flavors, and instead we're hanging out with heather. Someone did it, yes. That's a joke that you lay at the start and pays off at the end. We're looking more at kind of heather and burning wood and kind of a gritty, dirty character. So port casks and sherry casks are obviously giving this whiskey quite a lot of sweet fruitiness, but it is really being matched by this peat. And the way we got this peated whiskey is almost entirely down to the fact that the owner of GlenDronach at the time was also the owner of the Benriach Distillery, which is very known for doing Speyside peated whiskey. So basically one day when Billy Walker was still running the distilleries, he, being kind of an experimental person, had a barley delivery kind of off track. Well, that's what he always used to say. These days he says it was intentional, but there was a barley delivery to GlenDronach that was peated barley. And basically instead of turning it back or doing anything like that, these days he says he obviously got a peated whiskey sent to GlenDronach because it goes so well, but back then it was a different story. And he just ran it through the stills, and they ran it through the stills in the exact same production regimen that they do for their normal spirit. And it kind of shows you can still get a lot of the traditional GlenDronach spirit and a lot of what we got off the 2009, but with this kind of funky, smoky heart. And it is, this whiskey is almost, I wouldn't describe it as peaty, I would describe it as smoky.
I'm not drinking this whiskey yet.
You're not.
A question that came through a little while ago while we were waxing lyrical about the 1990, that sort of rings true here, is how long does it take between the sherry producers finishing with the barrel and sherry being poured out to whiskey going into the barrels?
So we get the casks over immediately. So they get on a boat as soon as possible, they get unloaded and they get filled ASAP.
Actually, would you ever consider doing a tasting where we can taste the Pedro and Jimenez also?
So Scott and I have actually done a couple of those in the past.
Excellent question. Would you ever consider about matching GlenDronach whiskies to the sherries they were matured in?
Thank you.
100%. Yes, we have. It's a little bit more difficult to do virtually. Fortifieds and things like sake, we haven't quite figured out. You know, they're not as temperamental as wine in terms of breaking down, drink them soon. So you've got a week, but we like to leave a week or two sometimes with things. So it's a really, really great experience to do. And we tend to also throw in Amontillado and Fino sherries and that sort of stuff.
Which always makes people's faces screw up because they're expecting sweet sherry.
Yeah, I'm new to the whiskey world, and it would be arguing for helpful tasting notes to understand the sherry.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the one thing that we've run into in introducing a sherry to tastings that maybe aren't expecting it is it can smash your palate. Like a Pedro Jimenez is a very sweet thing. And sometimes people get shocked by it. But when we're doing it in a format that's sherry, whiskey, sherry, whiskey, sherry, whiskey, at least we're taking that into account a little more.
There was a 1986 Pedro Jimenez we did, and it was about 86% sugar. But a shout out to Mary on the Zoom chat there. I did the sherry and whiskey tasting pre-COVID. It was excellent. So I'm not lying to you. We have done it. It was meant to be a regular sort of once every 2 months sort of tasting this year. Well, last year, and that hasn't quite happened. Question coming through here. This, you know, what you were talking about. This is a peated whiskey. How is it so sweet?
That's a question. Damn it.
Not a great question.
It's a bad question. No, it's a good question. Sweet peated whiskey is something that we're starting to see a lot more of in the industry, but Benriach always gets really kind of testy about it because distilleries like GlenDronach and even Balvenie are now being associated with sweet peat. But it is basically, we're combining all of the distillation, barley and production procedures of Speyside and Highland distilleries which are bright, fruity. We're getting apples and pears. In terms of GlenDronach, we're getting apples and blackberries. And then we're pairing it with peat that, instead of walloping the entire flavour, is kind of complementing the sweeter spirit with this sweeter, gristly flavour. And then finally, especially with the GlenDronach, or this GlenDronach, we're chucking it in port cask. So if anyone had the version that was port free, it didn't have this really bright berry finish on the back. The port cask is adding a lot of the kind of sugary character to that.
Is it also dependent on the peat that they get? Because you were saying that the first peated one that they were did was a mainland peat.
Yeah.
Is this batch mainland peat?
Yeah.
As well?
So all the GlenDronach peated whiskey is peated using mainland peat sources, and we've actually been wanting to do a tasting for ages where we, with Ben Riek, tour the peat bogs that the distillery was sourcing from over the years. So we did peated whiskey in the 70s. What did that taste like? Peated whiskey in the 80s. What did that taste like? 90s, 2000s. Because even the bog source, depending on how deep down the peat is, depending on the minerality in the dirt, is going to completely change the character of the peat.
So what's the character?
The best thing about that tasting, sorry, is that you get to eat the mud afterwards.
Yeah.
So you get a bowl of mud and a whiskey and you go for your life.
What's the characteristics of mainland peat that you would usually get?
So mainland peat, we're hanging out very much in kind of, if you think about what created the peat on the coast is often affected by coastal things like seaweed or sea battered trees. In the mainland, we're hanging out very much in like bushes, hardwood trees, forests. So we're getting more of a wood smoke character. And that's why I would describe this whiskey as smoky over peaty.
How big is a batch of the peated?
Oh, that's such an annoying question. How big is the batch of the peated runs? It's completely varied over the last few years, just as we're testing them out. Now that this is entering a core range, I think the last production was about 5,000 cases of it, which is 30,000 bottles. I might be overshooting a touch there, to be honest. And my brain is struggling to convert 9 litres to physical cases because that's the world that I live in.
And like obviously we're coming down from, I mean we're staying pretty solid on 50.5 into 48%.
It's a great point. We're actually still quite high on the proofs.
Yeah, and I think often with peated whiskies, sometimes a little bit unlike fruity whiskies, if you want more fruit, add a drop of water and it'll show. Sometimes people think, and some of those heavier flavours fall off the fruity and delicate notes. In smoky whiskies and heavily peated whiskies, often I find a drop of water will actually bring out the smoke. Often it's the alcohol hiding, the phenolics in there. I find that with things like Octomores and Port Charlottes and those sort of ultra peated whiskies, if you want the big smokers, add a couple of drops. So I'm going to do that now because I haven't done that quite yet.
But yeah, this one being a no-age stamen whiskey cut to 48, we can assume it's probably lost about 10% in the reduction in proof. In the past, our peated whiskey has sat at 46, so we are trying to climb it and keep it in the richer style that we do want GlenDronach to sit in terms of a profile.
For those playing in the room or playing on the social medias, I did throw the polling up into the Zoom chat. There's a clear winner. Who would have thought the most expensive oldest whiskey would be the winner? 71% going for the 1990, and then pretty even across the rest of them. In sort of minute sort of elements, but definitely the 1990. Just a quick show of hands. Like who thought if you had to pick one, if there was a poll and you had to pick one in the room, who thought the 1990 was the pick?
Oh, it's an overwhelming sea of hands.
No, I think there's about, what do we call that, about 15-20% in the room. So the other way, which I tend to agree with myself. I think that 92-93 combo, it'd be hard to pick between those two, but maybe arguably the 93 for me.
Definitely.
I reckon the pick up the night was 94 Oloroso.
Yeah, the 94 Oloroso, yeah. In fact, let's rejig that question. Who thought the 94 Oloroso, just from that shake of heads? Yeah, okay.
We got a bunch of sherry heads.
We're at least at 50% in the room for that one, which is interesting. I mean,
who backed you up on the 92, 93 on it?
Who backed me up? I don't get to see. I just saw that 3 people voted for each stuff thing, but they all get bonus things. Is that what it is? Yeah, they get bonus ones.
There's a dram on the way. If Scott tells you anything different, don't listen to him. It's coming.
Yeah. Look, that sort of brings us to the hour and a half that we've taken of your life that you'll never get back. But thank you very much. Whether you're in the room, on the Zoom chat, on Facebook, or indeed on YouTube, where we had some good numbers tonight. We're adapting to this new world, and we're increasing it better and better. As I said, and this is very much why we're doing this. This would have been a very, very simple tasting to run for 40 people with Thalita and Seamus standing up the front presenting. But why we're doing these sorts of things is if say it wasn't necessarily one of the presenters, maybe it was me that came down a bit sniffly this morning, all of a sudden we probably can't do this, which is why then we can still achieve this by having those ways and those methods to fall back on. So I love the fact that we were adapting up to about half an hour before we let people into this room today, because that is the way of the world, and that's the way that we do things. But the fact that we were able to do this, and there's not 80 angry people around Australia waiting for the next tasting, I think is a testament to your guys' flexibility, because you didn't even know what you were walking into today, did you? I said it's going to be a little bit different, but don't worry, we'll figure it out.
You asked me to come half an hour early to be comfortable with the room. I thought there was going to be like a flaming wheel in the middle or something.
Well, they're almost spots.
They're almost, oh, gosh. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a testament to you guys that we can actually put these tastings on. I know when COVID became a thing, Scott and I both got a little worried that we'd have to stop doing tastings in general. And I think that's my favourite part about launching out of these whiskies, is getting to waffle around in a room with you guys. So thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Scott, for adapting and making that possible.
It's far more important to applaud Seamus and the team from Brown-Forman to bring stuff in. A question that I thought was going to come a little bit earlier tonight that only has just come now is in bottle purchases. Now, yes, there are an amount of bottles to purchase. It is very limited. If everyone in this room said, I want one, I can't give it to you. If everyone on the half of this room said, I want one, I can't give it to you. So what is going to happen? And this is just a thing of allocations and supply, and having to supply the whole world, and also bottles being broken in between Scotland and Australia, and that 6-pack might have turned into a 5-pack in more than one case, not just for us, but all around Australia. So that's just the fact of it. I haven't talked about this at all during the tasting because I didn't want to, because I thought we should all drink whiskey and actually taste these things before we decide if we wanted to buy something or anything. But I have divided them up for what's available. There'll be a small amount available in the room. There'll be at least one of everything available online. Not everything that's available online will be available in the room right now. So if you are interested in anything, particularly I'm speaking to people watching online, is jump on the website. You can actually go down. I'll post the link in a second. But once we wrap up here, in about 5 minutes, the bottles will go up and we will just
go nuts.
Yeah, whoever. Congratulations to anyone who's lucky enough to grab one.
If too many people want them in the room, you'll notice there's a number under your chair. That's who you're fighting to the death with. So just be ready, everyone. I hope you brought weapons.
To Sean and to Jared, everyone on the Zoom chat, thank you for the kind words. I'm going to keep the Zoom chat open. So remember, as you're walking around, you've got a hot mic on, your audio is still working. But to everyone on the Facebook and the YouTube, thank you very much. We will see you soon. The idea was to get through this one, and now we can announce a lot more that we have in the back arsenal that we've sort of been holding on to figure out exactly how this will work, with the idea that we can bring our international guests back through onto that screen over there and into your lounge rooms. So if you are obviously at home and you've drunk all the whiskies tonight, please get an Uber from your living room to your bedroom tonight. But drink well and be happy, and thank you for joining us and coming along on this ride with us. So appreciate it. Cheers.
Cheers.